Welcome to AMS Weather Band's latest webinar, a Cat 5 5 years later, the lasting legacy of Hurricane Michael, with Pam Knox, Mark Wool, Casanova Nurse, and our moderator, Melissa Griffin. Before we begin, of course, I would like to go over the standard guidelines for the webinar today. Audience, if you have any questions for our panelists or moderator, please make sure that you put them in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. That'll be to the left of the chat button. We will also have some specific time for questions from the audience after the presentation, but we may address some of the questions during the course of the presentation if it is indeed appropriate. Now I would like to introduce today's moderator. Thank you, Melissa. Folks, Melissa Griffin currently serves as the Assistant State Climatologist at the South Carolina State Climatology Office. Melissa received a degree in meteorology from Florida State University and has worked in the weather and climate enterprise for the past 2 decades. Excuse me. Melissa is also involved in various weather-related outreach and education initiatives, including the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And with that being said, Melissa, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Gideon. Again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's kind of a poignant today with it being 5 years since Hurricane Michael made landfall near Mexico Beach, Florida, and became the first Category 5 hurricane to make landfall in the contiguous U.S. since Hurricane Andrew in 1992. The storm devastated communities in the Florida Panhandle and across portions of southeastern Alabama and southwestern Georgia. And tonight we have a fantastic panel of speakers who are going to discuss experiences, perspectives, and those lasting impacts on these communities and how the areas are recovering 5 years later. We're going to start our presentations off with Mark Wool. Mark Wool is currently the warning coordinating meteorologist at the National Weather Service office in Tallahassee. He took over that role in 2015, but has been a forecaster in that office since 1999. He serves as the main liaison between the office meteorologists, government agencies, emergency management, media partners, and he also sees public outreach across the particular county warning area. He began his career as an intern at the National Weather Service in Mount Holly, and that's also a shared office with Philadelphia. And he's worked in various forecast roles before becoming to Tallahassee. He's got his bachelor's degree from State University of New York, and did some graduate work at Penn State University. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mark and let him get us started. And our other panelists, we can go ahead and turn off our cameras while Mark is speaking.
All righty. Thank you, Melissa. Good evening, everybody. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right. I believe you all can see that screen. And with that, I will get myself situated here and we can get started.
Mark, real quick, it switched back to a regular screen and not the big screen.
Sure.
There you go.
All righty. So as soon as I get my, I have to shift this over. Hold on 1 second. All right. You still see the screen there?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. All right. So, yeah, I am happy to talk to y'all about what up to now has been far and away the most significant and challenging weather event of my long career, and I hope it remains so for the remainder of it. I've been in the Weather Service for nearly 30 years. My 30-year anniversary comes up later this month. So I'm going to give you a perspective today from what it was like to work through the hurricane from the landfalling National Weather Service office. Specifically, we're going to talk about some of the messaging challenges that we were dealing with an unprecedented event. We'll also talk about a couple of things that our office did for the very first time, including deploying on-site to 3 different county emergency operation centers, an extended period of specialized weather forecasting we call decision support services that continued for many, many months after the hurricane was over. I'll talk about another thing that we had very little experience with, and that is going out and surveying high watermark surveys, determining how high the water got in the storm surge. And then we'll kind of bring it home and kind of personalize a little bit and kind of explain to you what it's like for the employees to go through an event of this magnitude. And the last thing we'll do is we'll kind of touch on Mexico Beach, the kind of ground zero for Michael, how they're doing today. So to say that Hurricane Michael was one for the record books is really an understatement. It was the first Category 5 hurricane on record to make landfall in the Florida Panhandle. In fact, there hadn't even been a Category 4 prior to Michael, and the last Category 3 was back in the 19th century. So, this really was an unprecedented event. No one living in the Panhandle in 2018 would have experienced anything like this, at least there, including the grandparents. And it was the third strongest hurricane by pressure to ever make landfall in the United States, in the contiguous United States. The other thing that really complicated matters with messaging is we hadn't even had so much as a Category 1 hurricane along the Panhandle coastline. In the 10 years leading up to Michael, the blue and green lines on this map show tracks for tropical depressions and tropical storms during that period, but no hurricanes. And even in the entire period of record, which goes back to the middle of the 19th century, there's some red lines there. Those are Cat 3s, but no 4s or 5s. So like I said, unprecedented. The other thing we were dealing with was that this hurricane strengthened rapidly and went through several periods, what we call rapid intensification, all the way to landfall. If this hurricane had not encountered the Gulf Coast, it would have continued to strengthen. And you can see that all the way up to landfall, increasing winds the whole time with decreasing pressure. Now, this thing really developed quickly from a disorganized cluster of thunderstorms to a Category 5 hurricane in 4 days. You can see how quickly things rapidly intensified in that satellite loop. So I'm going to run through in these next several slides fairly quickly the timeline that we were dealing with as the forecast office and how things evolved through the process. First of all, the first time there was any indication by the National Hurricane Center that there was going to be potential for development in the northwestern Caribbean was on October 2nd. So that was 8 days ahead of landfall. But it wasn't until 5 days before landfall before confidence was fairly high that a system was going to develop. And this is when we first started messaging our partners via email. Then on the 6th, which is just 4 days before landfall, the Hurricane Center issued its first advisory, and the first cone was issued. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that the forecast was for a tropical storm landfall at Navarre. So we had to go from there to the ultimately what wound up happening, which was a Category 5 over Mexico Beach. So there's a lot of evolution of messaging through this process. And there's the inset I meant to call up before. So moving on the 7th, 3 days before landfall, the management team, we were scattered to the winds. I was in a campground in Alabama. My boss was out at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport on his way back from a business meeting, and the other middle manager in the office was on his way home from church. And he pulled off into a parking lot, and we had a powwow because we realized this could be a really, really much more serious situation than anyone, including the staff in our office, realized. And so we had to have a game plan, and we were going to hit the ground running beginning the next day, which was Columbus Day, a federal holiday, where none of us would have been in the office, but of course we all came in. So later that day, the Sunday the 7th, finally Michael got the name Michael. It became a tropical storm that day. We did our first webinar for partners that day, and at this point, even by this advisory, we were expecting a hurricane at least. Moving on to Monday, the 8th, 2 days before landfall, watches were issued along the coast. Michael became a hurricane. And we made the decision we were going to deploy our staff to emergency operations centers to embed within those decision makers' offices to help them deal with this hurricane. And then later that day on Monday, the warnings went up for a good chunk of the forecast area, not just the coast. So at this point on Monday, we were experiencing a major hurricane. So really, that's just 48 hours ahead of landfall, less than that really, where a forecast of major hurricane was just issued. On Tuesday, the day before landfall, our deployed meteorologists arrived at their respective emergency operation centers. We did our first ever Facebook Live broadcast. This is significant because the service was considered experimental at the time, and we had to get permission from our headquarters to even do it. So there's my boss, Tom Johnstone, my boss at the time, doing our first ever Facebook Live. On the 9th, Michael became a major hurricane officially, and staff started arriving in the office to shelter in place and hunker down, bringing with them food to last for days, bedding, and all of that stuff they may need. Another troubling thing we found out on the evening before landfall is that 290 of the 1,500 residents of Mexico Beach were planning to hunker down. We knew that was going to be an extremely dangerous situation. So we decided we needed to pull out all the stops, and in coordination with law enforcement, local emergency management, and media, we got the word out that, look, this is going to be unlike anything that you have experienced before, including social media graphics here. There's me on a very kind of dark, poorly lit Facebook live post that went out at midnight. And I remember thinking to myself, who's going to even see this? Well, I'll tell you what, people saw it. And one quote from the feedback we got was that I saw this guy from NOAA in a Facebook Live, and he was very, very serious, talking about catastrophic damage. And that's what prompted him to leave. I became known as the serious man from NOAA. We also used weather emergency alerts. It's, that's what pushes the warnings to your phone. Well, we repurposed those to get important life-saving do and don't information out, actionable stuff that folks could do. We were also all over the national media. Okay. Do you guys still see my screen?
No, it looks like it went black and your calendar's up.
All right. Hold on. You see it now?
No, we still see calendar.
That's okay. I apologize for that. Try to get this going here again. How about now?
We've got Wera up. Or the WE alerts.
Okay, good. So that's where we need to go. So again, we repurposed, say that 10 times fast, these messages before, during, and after the event to tell people when it was time to hunker down, and afterwards where to go to get water, when it was safe to return, and things like that. Our meteorologist deployed to the Leon County Emergency Operations Center, which is where Tallahassee is, the Bay County EOC, which was the landfall county, and there in the vest there is Justin Pullen. He hunkered down in that EOC through the eye wall of this system. And then we had a forecaster on loan to us from Miami go to Florida State University. Now, the significance of having Justin over at the EOC could not have been anticipated. As it turns out, every single person on the Emergency Operations Center staff and all the other responders were on the Verizon network, and Verizon went down hard. Justin alone had an AT&T phone, and he became the sole conduit of information in and out of that county for a couple of days. Now, they have redundancy built in now, but boy, I tell you, that was pretty lucky. So continuing with the timeline, this is landfall day. Fortunately, through the concerted efforts of getting the word out, only 50 people decided to hunker down and ride it out in Mexico Beach. 4 of them died. So that's a pretty high mortality rate, and we're glad we got most of those people out. The office issued another first, the first ever extreme wind warning in anticipation of the landfall of a major hurricane. We issued those for the onset of major hurricane force winds, or winds of 110 miles an hour or higher sustained. And then, of course, landfall occurred at 1:30 in the afternoon on the 10th. That's a fierce-looking storm, if I ever saw one. Just as it was making landfall, we lost all of our comms in the Tallahassee office. We had to shove all of our responsibilities over to the Jacksonville office, and they were prepared to take over for us. All right, next up. Again, extreme wind warnings. We had to explain to the public what these were. They had never seen anything like this before, so there was that additional effort. We tried to get that information out ahead of time, but we'd never issued one of these, and we issued them all the way up into Georgia. Now, everybody knows Mexico Beach was the ground zero, but this graphic really drives it home. All the red X's there show buildings that were completely gone. There was nothing left. They were wiped from the slabs, and that's virtually everything on the ocean side of US 98 there. So clearly we had a vulnerable population, very limited communications, compromised structures, tarps everywhere, tents everywhere, first responders, and God love them, these guys, restoring the utility work, these heavy protective jackets and coats, and there was a heat wave the week after Michael. The heat index was 100 degrees. It was miserable being out there, I can assure you. So we wound up putting up 2-time-a-day emails, text only, for the first responders, and also to dispel rumors, because people kept thinking another hurricane was coming, and they were petrified about that, as you can imagine, and they had no way to verify, so we were trying to put that information out in these emails as well. These Twice daily emails continued through December, and daily ones continued through February 28th. We were even doing specialized decision support for the marina as they were trying to declutter that in March and April of 2019. We continued to focus our social media after the event on safety in terms of returning home, the do's and don'ts, when it's safe to come home and when it's not. We continued to use wireless emergency alerts to show people where food and water were located, etc., and information about power restoration. Another Herculean effort was the survey work we did afterwards. Every green, black, and red dot on that map shows you a damage point. No fewer than 6 National Weather Service offices joined us in fielding teams to survey over 1,700 damage points after Michael, from the beach well into Georgia. High water marks were collected over a 3-day period, which are the blue dots on the inset everywhere from St. Mark's over into Panama City. We had never done this survey work. Only one person in our office, had any experience doing the survey work. So we were fortunate to have the assistance of the Harris County, Texas Flood Control District, who had just gone through this effort the previous year during Hurricane Harvey, come and join us in doing our high water mark surveys. And I want to draw your attention to that lower right, which is the El Governor Inn hotel. It's the largest hotel and largest structure really in town. And that water punched through that second story room, those rooms, and even punched out the back wall on the street side. Very power of water is immense. This is the structural damage. I'm going to focus you on that 3,200 structures were completely destroyed, 3,200, and many more others affected. We got a new cut through the Cape San Blas, the St. Joseph Peninsula, over in Gulf County, a new pass cut through. So all sorts of navigation hazards that needed to be accounted for. Hospitals that were nearly destroyed and became inoperable. Power outages. You can see many of these counties, it's kind of a busy graphic, but so many were 95 to 100% of the residents without power. Now, the populated counties with lots of resources like Leon County in the dark brown, most of us had power back in a couple of days. Not all, but most. Some of the rural counties still were 35 to 45% without power 18 days after landfall. These are the fatalities. The direct fatalities were contributed to Hurricane Michael. There were 8. 5 of them were drownings in storm surge. And they were, look at the ages, almost all elderly. So that's another messaging challenge. Getting through to elderly folks and motivating them to get out of harm's way. Unfortunately, an 11-year-old girl was killed by a tree falling through her home up there in Georgia, Donaldson Hill. Now, switching it to more personal note, this is a picture of the shift change of our crew as the 12-hour day shift was briefing in the 12-hour mid shift. And this was a heck of a stressful time for us, especially when you consider the fact that we had 4 brand new forecasters, including our MIC. Now, he had experience in Harvey, but they had not, most of these forecasters hadn't worked any tropical weather. So we fortunately did a mid-season retraining in August, and that helped out a lot. Of course, we all had to prepare our homes and get ready for extended power outages. And then we had to move into the office. And you can see all these cots here. Somebody slept in one of our closets, wherever we could find a place to sleep. We had concerns about family. We could not leave because we were obligated to be at work, and it was a big, big stress, as you can imagine. Fortunately, our boss was able to book some nearby hotel rooms for us. So the hotel rooms had a generator. Power lines were buried, so they were going to have less of a chance to lose power, and they did not. And they were within walking distance of the office. We also kept the service backup going so neighboring offices doing our forecast so we could have a couple of days to unwind, get some rest, and assess the damage to our homes. This was a team effort. We couldn't have done it alone, and we didn't do it alone. We had forecasters on loan to us from the Houston office, from the Miami office, and we had help with surveys from those offices as well as Mobile and Jacksonville and Tampa. Looking forward. Now, this looking forward slide I put together just after Hurricane Michael. So we're going to compare this to what we have right now. But we needed a better understanding of rapid intensification. That was clear. Time of departure graphics. When were the tropical storm winds going to end? That was in demand from the emergency managers. We need better observing equipment. A lot of it was blown away. Better internet in the forecast office. Targeted messaging to vulnerable groups like elderly folks. and we needed to apply social science found after Hurricane Michael to our messaging. And finally, at the time, continue on-site deployments. Now, this is how things are now. The Hurricane Center is much better at forecasting rapid intensification. They've really made big strides in the last 5 years, as evidenced in Hurricane Idalia this year and Ian last year. Time of departure graphics are now available routinely to emergency managers. We have more robust sensors deployed ahead of hurricanes. And the Weather Service as a whole is focusing more on targeted messaging to vulnerable groups, not just elderly and not just during tropical. Social science has continuously worked into the evolution of our messaging. However, one thing that hasn't been maintained is the on-site deployments. We're forced by the pandemic to deploy virtually using mechanisms like this, Zoom. And we found that we could provide that focused level of service to more than one county with one individual. And so that's what we've been doing since then. And here's my last slide, Mexico Beach today. There's that big hotel, the El Governor Inn. It's the largest hotel in town, and it took nearly 5 years to reopen. It only reopened a couple of months ago. The mayor's hardware and tackle store opened in February of 2022, probably the first business there to open, I believe. The first hotel, the Driftwood, took nearly 4 years to reopen. And currently, there's only one restaurant in town with air conditioning. One. Mostly food trucks, other than that. There is no grocery store or pharmacy yet in Mexico Beach. But one thing that hasn't changed is they did not change the development codes. They didn't allow developers to come in and change the character of the town. Mexico Beach will remain a small town. And I know there are some collections going on to help them restore their pier for the fishing tourists. So that's all I've got, Melissa. If we're going to take questions now or wait, either way.
Thank you, Mark. That perspective is just kind of amazing. We all, on this webinar, think about what National Weather Service employees go through as they're facing these particular type of events. And we did have a question. We had a question from Casper, and Casper wanted to know, during the post-storm assessments, did you do any type of surveys on like the military installations, such as like Tyndall Air Force Base?
We tried, because Tyndall Air Force Base was about as ground zero as Mexico Beach, but there was a lot of reasons that they weren't prepared to allow us to come rummaging through. There was some classified stuff that was suddenly made available when their large hangar roof was removed. So we had to rely largely from what we could see from US 98, the highway that kind of splits right through Tyndall Air Force Base, and rely on the military doing their own assessments.
And did they share that information with you so that you could at least have some sort of documentation to not necessarily like the classified stuff, but just as a whole, yes, what the damage was on the base?
Yeah, in a general sense, we have that information available. Every structure, every single one on the Air Force Base was damaged. So yeah, they shared what they could.
I think one of the other interesting points that you brought up was about a week after Michael came through, you were dealing with heat. And heat indices pushing 100 and 101 degrees. And of course, this is towards the end of October. And so that seems a little, I don't necessarily think about that lasting impact or what happens after the storm. And I know we saw that in Michael. Did you have any heat related illness issues or any of that heat that impacted the recovery efforts?
I'm sure there were. We didn't get specific information on that, but what we did do is temporarily lower our thresholds for issuing certain advisory products, like heat advisories, like significant thunderstorm alerts, and what have you, because we had all these exposed people. We couldn't just ignore that. So we did issue more alert and advisories at lower thresholds because of the increased vulnerability. I was out there doing high watermark surveys on the Tuesday after in a 100-degree heat index, and it was grueling. But I looked up at the telephone, the guys repairing the utility work in their heavy, heavy coats, and I couldn't imagine them doing that all day long. Those folks are very dedicated people, and they've got my respect for sure.
Thanks, Mark. We appreciate your perspective from the National Weather Service. We're going to hold the rest of questions for Mark until the end. So if you think of a question you'd like to ask Mark, please put it in our Q&A. We'll come back to him at the end of our presentations. Next, we're going to turn it over to Casanova Nurse. And Casanova is the chief meteorologist for the news department at WTLX TV. It serves the the Florida State Florida's capital city, which is Tallahassee, along with communities in the Big Bend and southern Georgia. He first arrived at WTLX in 2003, went to work for Houston for 2 years before coming back to WTLX in 2008. And Casanova is also one of our certified broadcast meteorologist seal holders, and he received that in 2007. So Cass, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you give the perspective from what you saw and what you went through as a TV Met during this event.
Well, I appreciate it, Melissa. Thank you so much. And I'm glad folks have found interest and time in their evening to sign on and take a little glance at our perspectives of what the storm had to offer in our respective communities. So the scariest part of any Zoom meeting is the share screen part, because it always seems to kind of do what it wants to do. So hopefully we can get the full screen, and I think it is there from what I can tell.
We're good.
And if everything, all right, everything looks good, we'll go on from here, because, you know, a lot of folks, you know, old fashioned, or even, you know, the newest trends of digital media and TikTok and all that stuff. I don't even know if TikTok was around in 2018. But the point is, people got their information through a wide array of sources. Yet when the weather gets kind of rough and tough, there's still a lot of dependence given on their local broadcasters. So I'm going to give a little perspective of my experiences through it all. First, I'm going to start with a background of the area, because I understand not everybody on our webinar is in Tallahassee or Florida or Georgia, maybe from other areas. As far as our TV station signal, it reaches out to over 24 counties across northern Florida, also known as the Big Bend region, and many counties within southern Georgia. And of those counties, our TV station, WTXL ABC 27, covers a smaller portion of that broader area, because there is overlap from stations in other markets like in Panama City or in Albany, Georgia, or even Gainesville for that matter. So we do cover a fewer amount of counties. When it comes to where we are in Tallahassee, compared to where our facilities are here in Midway, which is a small town just off the interstate in Gadsden County, and our transmitter site where we send our signal across our service area, that's located in northern Jefferson County, just south of the state line. All those were pretty critical in determining what kind of level of service we could have when we consider the track of Hurricane Michael, just to the west of where we are. So that was very crucial in keeping us as a source of information through the worst of the storm. Now, our TV market is a lot different from what you might see in Atlanta or Orlando. We do have all 4 major networks represented here in the state line area, but only 2 of them produce local news. That would be us, the ABC station, and our counterparts at the CBS station. The Fox local affiliate has their local news produced by the CBS station. So it's technically an extension of what CBS station does. And our NBC station doesn't have any local news presence, but they do have sister stations in Pensacola and West Palm Beach that will provide weather updates, especially in a breaking weather setup like what Michael was. Tallahassee is the population center, but we are about 250-some thousand people amid a broad rural landscape that's really covered in forests, agricultural interests, small towns, a couple of county seats that have maybe a few tens of thousands of people, but most of the areas more sparsely populated than your metro areas down in the peninsula. And in a market like this, we don't have a lot of breaking news coverage. We don't have choppers flying and trying to go after the latest police chase. This is kind of a low key, if you will, kind of market where stories focus more on, well, you know, the farmers market in Monticello, or, you know, the new store opening in Moultrie, or things like that, kind of smaller scale coverage that doesn't really warrant extended live news coverage or breaking news. And there's significant overlap from the Albany TV stations in our southern Georgia service region. So there are some more options for folks who are within South Georgia. So that's a little background of what our market is like. But what do we do here at WTXL? Well, I started as chief in 2008. And when I got here, I wanted to go through the overall severe weather plan, because it's not just the meteorologists that are, conducting the storm coverage or whatever happens, but there has to be some kind of communication with the reporters and the news director and the assignment editor and other workings within the newsroom. So we wanted to make sure that we had a set plan that as new meteorologists come and go, the ones that replace them are able to kind of be up to speed as far as what we do in advance of any kind of weather situation, but especially tropical and severe weather. So we organized the plan, communication lines with managers and other staff, make sure folks in certain roles meet the expectations that are laid out for them. Also went into the engineering department and make sure that they were able to check on things like the transmitter or the generator outside to make sure things were able to operate when we needed those things to operate the most. And we did have a lesson learned through the landfall of Hurricane Hermine, which came up right into Appalachia Bay and made landfall at St. Mark's, which is roughly 18, 20 miles to the southeast of Tallahassee. So this was kind of a low-end hurricane, but the main effects that many folks had experienced was power outages. And a landfalling hurricane in early September with the eye wall coming over metro area, lots of power outages. So that did have huge impacts, even though the destructive forces of this were not quite as severe as Michael, of course. But this was a situation that kind of put our action plan into action, where we provided several hours of coverage. But at that time, it was just me and 2 other meteorologists that we had on staff. There weren't many news contributions. We didn't have reporters going out and doing, reports live at the coast. It was just me, the 2, the radar, and just tracking minute by minute what the storm was doing and kind of taking in pieces of information as it was shared to us. So that experience kind of gave me the urge to make sure that we can beef up our inter-office preparedness a little bit more. So it's not just 90% of the coverage leaning on meteorologists, but also to make sure that news is a little more aware and a little more involved in a storm situation like what we had. We've always exchanged emails from staff to staff. I would leave an email about a weather pattern change to the next person coming in the morning. They would leave a note to me or whoever comes in next. So we communicate very frequently every day. And in those tropical situations, we would make sure that the news director would be aware of certain suspect areas that are out there. So if there were something that would come up as a local risk to us, they would know about it, and then they would be able to put their processes in play to respond to any local risk. Plus, we needed support for the various streams of weather information dissemination, publishing on the website, establishing live streams, getting systems to where we don't have to type in and shoot out something for a consumer to get an alert. So automated systems were in need. And fortunately, with a change of events over time, we were able to get some of those sources. At the time when Hermine hit, we were owned by a small group, family-run group that had 2 other TV stations. In 2017, we were acquired by a larger group, a regional group called Raycom Media. So being part of a group with dozens of stations instead of just 3, that did allow us to get more of those resources needed. So there was more coordination between the regional stations and us. There was better systems that were employed here at the station to up our social media integration. We had got a 4th meteorologist out of that. So that helped us very much. And the sale to Raycom was not connected to the hurricane. It was just one of those industry patterns that had been ongoing at the time. So when we started getting hints that Michael was going to become something before it got its name, we were monitoring that blob of moisture well to the south. Like Mark, I was on a weekend camping trip, except I was in Madison, which is nearby Tallahassee, with my family. But even with that, I kept abreast of what's going on through the phone and all that stuff, and shared emails and contacted the general manager. It's like, hey, this is something we need to watch. And this allowed us to have a better, firmer grasp of how to respond to a growing threat by having as much advance notice as possible, because more people are in the loop and more people can coordinate. So when the threat became a little more obvious across the area, that's when, of course, my camping trip, it was scheduled to end on Monday anyway. But I came back in, and we wanted to make sure that we got the message across to people without hype, without causing panic. Like was mentioned earlier, this was an extraordinary situation that most folks here had not been through before. So our feed of information became steadier, but we kept this approach to where we make sure people understand what we knew about the situation and what was still quite variable that we could not hone in on. I used to love showing spaghetti models. Now I can't stand them. And this storm in particular helped me to reduce my reliance on showing the squiggly lines going across a map. It also helped to kind of hone in on where those highest impacts would be felt compared to the region. Because again, we covered 20-some counties. Swanee River counties to the east would get much less effect than the Apalachicola River to the west. And then when some of those threats became more solid in terms of evidence and likelihood, we strengthened our tone, but again, keeping more of a pragmatic approach. You know, we know this may happen. You should prepare for X, but you know, areas to the east, you may not get so much. And it wasn't just people relying on us. We wanted to make sure people were able to follow trusted and reputable sources, no matter if it was from ABC 27 or other stations in the local market or other media sources, or of course the National Weather Service. So it was more about getting people informed and connected to the information so they can make the decisions they need to make in terms of how they individually will respond. There were strength in numbers, because 4 meteorologists on staff, we were able to successfully keep someone on staff the entire time. We had assistants, reporters, producers, photographers coming in from neighboring stations. People who do not work on a news product on a daily basis here at the station, they contributed. So it was an all-encompassing coverage plan that involved anchors who were getting information from the EOCs and other sources and law enforcement. We had reporters throughout the impact zones. We had live reporting capabilities, including some like that individual there who came in from Birmingham to contribute to coverage along the Gulf Coast. Now, we're based in Tallahassee, but at the time, we were co-owned with a station that's in Panama City, a Fox affiliate that didn't have its own news coverage. And earlier that summer, it was my responsibility to put on a 1-minute forecast that would air on Channel 28 out there in Panama City, pre-recorded. I could only mention very brief, main points of a forecast. And when this monster of a storm was coming in, I was still left with 1 minute to cover a major landfalling hurricane. I don't know if our coverage was simulcast over there. There were 2 other stations that were on top of it. And after the storm went through, those little clips were not resumed for a number of reasons. But when the storm came in, it put our preparation efforts, to the test. Are we able to manage this, keep the information flowing, keep people informed, and keep a level head? And I think with all those efforts that we put into it in years past and in the months prior to Michael, we were able to have this coordinated, cohesive effort to keep information going. We had digital streams going. We had a lot of updates on digital. Our equipment went through to where we did not have any failures to my knowledge. And there was a point where ABC News, their streaming channel, carried WTXL on their streaming source when the Panama City ABC affiliate went down. So we were able to keep that more broad national coverage through their streaming efforts, which helped to carry out that message as far as what was going on. I'll touch briefly on a personal note, because we may seem like supermen and superwomen on TV when we're talking about weather, but we're not. We're people. We have emotions. I had to get my family out to St. Augustine so they wouldn't have to endure. I had a picture of my late mother and my late father to kind of comfort me because of all this mess that was about to unfold. And that helped to drive home the reality that even in these storm situations where there's a lot of responsibility that I carry and other meteorologists carry in the market, we're people. We need time to decompress. Mark alluded to it earlier that, hey, we need a break from this. This was a high stress situation, and we need to step back from it from time to time. So that's helped me to handle future storm situations like the one we just had with Hurricane Idalia and Ian last year. Also, it helped our efforts to make it more customized, our outlooks more customized to zones rather than the broad stretch of the area, because one community may get next to nothing while the other community gets hammered. So having those breakdown by zones really helped to relay those differences in storm impacts, and it helped in the overall messaging. And having more people and more available resources at our disposal really helped our overall coverage to become more successful in all. And as mentioned, and what will be mentioned in a few minutes, those inland storm threats, they became reality. We preached over and over for years that, yes, there can be strong winds and well inland can get hurricane effects. And, for a long time, it just seemed like, it could happen. It hasn't happened. It's not a big deal. But Michael helped to make that reality clear to people. So, the advice about people preparing even away from the coast, this justified those years of preaching about that, and a reemphasis on services that became unavailable, like power, like internet and cell phones and things like that. So it brought a lot of things into clearer view for the Tallahassee region and surrounding areas as well. These are the ways you can contact me if you feel led to over the next few minutes or days. And with any Q&A, we'll handle those as our moderator, Melissa, sees fit. Thanks for listening, and I appreciate your attention. And hopefully this was an enlightening topic for you and some information that you could find useful.
Thanks so much, Cass. We did have a couple of comments, one of which was from Scott. He is really interested in getting in contact with you about the severe weather communication plan. And so if you can leave your contact information up there, Scott, you can hopefully grab it from there. In mentioning that, one of the other comments that I saw was you had said when you came to WTLX in 2008, you decided to go ahead and start doing the establishment of a plan. Was this a plan that you had envisioned, or was this maybe something you had also seen already in place in Texas that you felt to bring to Tallahassee?
I did have influence from my experience in Texas, because about 3 weeks before I resumed or came here to take the chief position, I was at the CW station in Houston with Chief Keith Monahan, and we were there when Hurricane Ike hit. Category 2 hit the Bolivar Peninsula near Galveston Island, and that was a storm situation. That was my first experience at covering a landfalling hurricane when I was in Houston. So those experiences and Keith's overall tenure at that station and his experiences over his career really helped to shape and mold how I can take what I learned there and the experiences with Ike, how I can apply that to here in the Tallahassee area and at WTXL. And that's not to say there wasn't a plan from previous staffers, but from what I was able to learn through that time at Houston, which is a very similar, except for the size of the city, but right on the coast, hurricane susceptible. Those experiences help to shape my action plan here and take those qualities and make them established here.
Thanks, Cass. That's fantastic. It looks like Scott did get your information, so you probably will hear from him shortly about that. We're going to now turn it over to, as Mark and Cass have both kind of alluded those inland impacts by bringing on a good friend of mine and colleague, Dr. Pam Knox. She is the director of the University of Georgia's Weather Network, which is an agricultural mesonet that observes weather and soil conditions. It's been in Georgia since 1991. She is a agricultural climatologist and for UGA, and writes a daily blog called Climate and Agriculture in the Southeast. In the past, Pam was the Wisconsin State climatologist and the Georgia assistant climatologist, as well as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service Office of Hydrology. She's a certified consultant meteorologist with the American Meteorological Society since 1998 and has served as a past chair for the Board of CCMs. And it is my pleasure to introduce Pam, Pam, I can't wait to hear, we talked so much about the impacts directly at the coast, but, Michael just had such far-reaching impacts that, somehow, when you see the pictures of the devastation along the coast, you forget about the devastation that happened inland. So I appreciate you taking time to talk to us about those agricultural impacts tonight.
Sure. Well, I think when most people think of Michael, they remember those terrible pictures on Mexico Beach and so on. But Michael actually caused a tremendous amount of damage to agriculture. And so that's what I'm going to focus on in my few minutes here. Just to remind you, and of course, Mark and Kaz have already shown this, there were hurricane force winds all the way from the coast there near Mexico Beach, all the way up to almost Macon, central Georgia. And that caused a tremendous amount of damage. Keep in mind that this track that goes from the very southwest corner of Georgia up to the northeast towards Augusta, that I have not drawn on individual maps, but you just sort of have to keep visualizing that as you do it. When I talked to the Weather Service people that were doing post-storm surveys, they said the track, driving through the track to do the storm surveys, it was like driving through a track of a 25-mile wide tornado. You can just imagine that. You've all seen pictures of tornado damage before. Now make it 25 miles or even 40 miles wide, as it was in some places near the coast of Florida. Most of the heavy rain was to the northwest of the center of the storm and occurred before the storm came through, as is very typical. So we had the high winds causing some damage. We had the rain causing some damage as well. And we're going to look at that. Here's a map. Mark showed something already about this, where the previous storms have occurred. And really, there has been nothing in this part of Georgia, the southwest part of the Georgia, that has had anything and nobody's ever remembered a storm like this. And so it's just amazing. And as Mark also pointed out, it only took 2 days from the time it was declared a hurricane to when it made landfall. So there was very little time for preparation, which is important for farmers, because if you have a field of 300 acres of cotton, how are you going to harvest it in 2 days? You're probably not. And so you have to really think about what you can do in the time that's allowed you before you have to really shut down. I just want to mention here, I am the director of the University of Georgia Mesonet, and our station in Donaldsonville in Seminole County there had the highest wind speed of any weather station in the state. They had 115 miles per hour. That's a picture of it the day after. And you can see it's still standing. It's got loose cables on it. It's missing its solar panel, but fortunately the batteries were still there, so it kept all its data. And so it's out by the Donaldsonville Airport. It's got a nice open exposure. The winds were only at 3 meters above the ground instead of 10 meters as the Weather Service stations are. So if it had been at a regular height, it probably would have recorded a higher wind speed than that. And I'm also very proud to say that the Mesonet stations were back on in about 4 hours because we all had solar power. The Weather Service offices were hard power. And so because of that, it took them longer to come back. We did use Verizon cell phones for our modems. And so that was the delay mostly, is the 4 hours were the delay for waiting for the cell service to come back up to our area. But we're very proud of the fact that we kept that thing going all the way through with very little downtime. And the downtime was really conditions that were beyond our control. So I want to talk for a few minutes about the different kinds of crops that are being produced. And I show all these maps to show the whole U.S. because some of you are not from the Southeast. You can kind of see where the different crops are produced. Probably the number one crop that was impacted by Michael was cotton. And that's because Michael hit right at the peak harvest season for cotton. Now, keep in mind, Michael's path going from the southwest part of Georgia up to Augusta cuts right through the middle of that big cotton belt in Georgia. A lot of the fields were already defoliated. When you harvest cotton, you defoliate with chemicals to get rid of the leaves, and so it's much easier to actually pull the cotton balls off of the plants. So that means with no leaves there to protect them, those bolls were just vulnerable to those high winds and the rain that came in. I heard many stories from farmers that were trying to go out and they're harvesting 24 hours a day, trying to pull in as much cotton as they could, because it's a little bit safer once it's in the bales, because it's got a little bit more wind protection, but just really a fraction of what they could do. One farmer that I talked to said that he was able to get 12 acres out of 300 acres harvested. And so that's their income for the year. And so if they lose most of their income, there's some crop insurance that will help cover the difference, but really just very little. You can see some of the pictures on the bottom right there. It just is a total mess. You can't get the cotton off the ground. It's all dirty. It's all wet. The harvesters can't pick it up. And so, most of it's done mechanically now. There's not very much that's done by people anymore because it's just not efficient. So one farmer said to me also, I can't tell the difference between what I picked and what I haven't, because it was just all so blown off the plants. Fortunately, this year, when Idalia came through about a month early, and so the cotton was not in such a vulnerable state, and so losses from cotton this year were not quite as high. But it's just the worst possible timing for cotton production in the Southeast, and just tremendous losses from that. Another crop that we grow here in Georgia is peanuts. And again, if you think of where the storm went from the southwest part of the state up to Augusta, it went right through the middle of the peanut production. Peanuts are one of our bigger crops in Georgia. Peanuts were about a month away from being harvested. So, and peanuts are underground, and so they were less affected by the hurricane, but the rain really caused a lot of problems. The plants were battered by the wind. They lost a lot of leaves. And so the peanut pods were not filling up very well because they weren't getting as much sunshine because there were so few leaves on it. And also the rain made the soil so wet that it was really hard to get any equipment into the fields. Those tractors and combines are pretty heavy. Even with the sandy soil that we have there, you can't really drive that stuff in. It compacts the soil. Of course, that makes it harder to get the peanuts out. And all those really wet conditions also tend to rot out the vines, so that when you try to pull the peanuts out of the ground, they break right off, and your yield is lost because it stays in the ground. Another problem was that with all the damage to the infrastructure, even if you could harvest your peanuts, there was nowhere to bring it, because most of the buying points where they stored all these harvested peanuts, they were blown away. And so producers had a crop and they didn't know what to do with it because there was nowhere to bring it. There's some temporary things that you can do. You can buy these ginormous bags to put the crops in, but you have to get them in because most people don't have them available. One thing that did save them, I think, a little bit was the fact that the peanut harvest was delayed because spring was wet. So they probably planted a little bit later than usual. And so that helped with peanut production. There were still certainly losses from that, but not as bad as the cotton. Another loss that was really big during Michael was pecans. You can see here is the total acres of all pecans as of 2012. And you can see that Southwest Georgia is by far the primary source of pecans in the United States, and certainly in Georgia as well. So many trees were blown down that we had one person say they had a 45-acre orchard in Seminole County, there again in the Southwest, that had 2 trees standing at the end. There's a picture on the bottom right there that just shows all these trees that are pushed over by the wind, destroys the roots. Of course, you can't push them back up because you've destroyed the integrity of the tree. And even the little picture in the middle there, the seedlings were all torn apart too. A lot of the nuts that weren't ripe yet were blown off the trees. And once they're on the ground, they weren't ripe, so you couldn't harvest them and somehow ripen them off the tree. So you lost the crop of nuts that was on the tree, but then you also lost the trees itself. When you put a pecan tree in the ground, it usually takes 10 years before it gets to commercial production. So for all these farmers that lost their trees, first you got to clear all the trees off, and then you have to plant new trees in there and let them grow up to the point where they can actually be harvested again. They also had problems with the processing points. Where do you bring the nuts when you have them harvested? And so it's just a tremendous loss there from pecans as well. In the storm we just had, Idalia, it hit the southeast part. You see there's not as much production there, but it had really increased quite a bit since 2012 because their trees were not as affected by Michael, and so they were still producing. Forest is another thing. In Georgia, forest is a commercial crop to a large extent. A lot of paper production and wood pellet production and so on. And so as all these trees were knocked down, and in some cases, it was more than 90% of the trees were lost all over the place. You couldn't really go in and harvest them because they're all twisted together. The number of trees that were down just totally destroyed the value of trees in the market because there was so much wood that was available that the price to harvest that and get that to a sawmill, if the sawmills had power, was just not worth really doing. So a lot of that really caused a lot of problems. Another thing that you don't always think about is that a lot of the farmers in that part of the state use tree lots as retirement savings. They plant a few acres of pine trees, and then when they retire, they sell that and it gets cut down and they get income from that, and that becomes their retirement income. So they lost a lot of the pine trees, snapped over in the wind. They lost their whole retirement income because they had it as a woodlot. Caused a lot of damage to roads and streams. And another thing that has continued to be a problem with the forest is that all that wood that's on the ground has left the forest very vulnerable to insects. There's a lot of broken branches, so it's easy for pests to get in, a lot of diseases. And then forest fires has been a huge issue, especially in some of the drier years that we've had. You can see the map there that Mark provided to me that shows where the timber damage was in Georgia. It's just tremendous damage along the path of that hurricane. So that has been another big loss as far as agriculture to Georgia. Another thing that we don't think about, it's not a crop, but it's how we grow the crops, is irrigation equipment. The dots there all represent the number of acres that are irrigated, and most of these are irrigated using these big pivots that you might see. You're more often likely to see them when you're flying over the center part of the country. We have a lot of those in the southeast because the soil is very sandy, so it doesn't take long for the plants to get affected by dry spells. And so a lot of people use these giant pivot systems. Each one can cost $100,000 or more to go, to put in and to maintain. And they're just lying twisted on the ground because the winds were so high that there's just really no way to do that. In addition, of course, damage to barns, harvesting equipment, some of the rain, if they didn't move the harvesting equipment out of low-lying areas, damaged harvesting equipment. Fencing, animals were out because the fences were down because trees fell on them. And the roads were out, so it was a problem if you're trying to get milk out because there were washouts from the rain. And of course, the farmers' homes were also destroyed, especially affected many smaller farmers because they usually didn't have a whole lot of insurance. And so that really became an issue for them. Power, Mark talked about power a little bit. You might not think about power in terms of agriculture, but power is just so important for agriculture because we have a lot of chicken houses. The chickens have to be ventilated because it's really hot. And if they don't get ventilation, they will suffocate. They don't get water if there's no pumps. Livestock production, if you don't have power, who's going to milk 100 head of cattle? It's very hard to do. Who's going to keep the milk cold until you can pump it? You can bring it out with a truck. And ventilation. Also, refueling, all that equipment takes gasoline or diesel fuel. Vegetable and meat processing, that the vegetables continue to ripen and they have to be processed into cans or into frozen packets and so on. And so all of that caused tremendous damage. There's a picture here that shows the before and after lighting, and you can see there's an area along the path there in the dotted line that just went black. 100% loss of power during that time. And some of those places lost power for a couple of weeks. Now, you might have a diesel generator with a few days worth of fuel, but it's very rare to have people have enough fuel that they can continue to power things for 2 weeks, because that's a lot of fuel, and it's a lot of money that you have to have tied up in that fuel. So that was also a critical issue for agriculture. Some of the other crops that got damaged, sugarcane, corn was blown over. It's hard to harvest with a machine when it's all blown over like that. They lost a lot of forage and hay. Young citrus is a new crop that's going on in Georgia. A lot of those trees got destroyed, and you can see the vegetables on the top right there. Green peppers scattered all over the ground. You can't sell those because you don't know what kind of water conditions they've been in. They might have been exposed to some sort of chemicals or oil, or some sort of disease. So all of that has to just be thrown away. Overall losses to Georgia agriculture, overall it was about $2.3 to $2.8 billion just to agriculture. You can see the breakdown here. Timber, 763 million. Pecans, not only the loss in this year's crop, but also in trees and in future income, because they lost 10 years worth of income from the trees that were destroyed. Cotton, vegetables, poultry, $8 million in birds. I think I saw from Idalia that in Florida they lost about 7 million in birds. Again, it's a power issue, and also because the roofs tend to blow off of the chicken houses. Peanuts, the green industry, container nursery, and so on. So all of that is just amazing. And of course, it wasn't just Georgia either. Here's some of the damage to the other states. Georgia got about half the agricultural damage of all of the agricultural damage, which was about $4.5 billion. You can see that Southeast Alabama had about 300 million. Florida, all kinds of damage to cotton and cattle and peanuts. They also have a lot of poultry down there and pecans. South Carolina, which by then the winds were a little bit lighter, but they still had a lot of damage to infrastructure and to crops there, especially in cotton. North Carolina have a lot of agriculture in the eastern part of the state. It's very rural. So they also lost a lot to livestock and poultry. The rain also caused problems for swine production, and some of that as well. Virginia even lost some. They were out sort of away from the main part of the storm, but between the rain and the remainder of the winds there, had a lot of problems. So overall, agricultural losses were about $4.5 billion. About half of that came from Georgia alone. The total loss from all causes was about $25 billion. So about 1/5 of the total losses was due to all this loss from agriculture. Just amazing amount of work. And of course, there's all these other things that are much harder to quantify. We've already talked about how hard it is for the first responders to deal with this, where they're trying to, help their own farmers or help their own clients. But at the same time, they have to deal with losing their own houses, having to make sure that their families were safe. Wasn't just the farmers that lost money either, because the farm-related businesses that sell equipment, that sell fertilizer, that process it all, they all lost their income for at least 1 year, and in most cases, far more than 1 year. Some of that is insured, but certainly not all of it. There is no work for farm workers. They have a lot of seasonal workers that come in for some of those crops, like the vegetable crops. They didn't have anywhere to go. They couldn't work because nobody could pay them because they didn't have any income. And so really a problem for them. 200,000 people had to leave. So there were fewer people left to help recover. And somebody's got to do the work of cleaning up all the trees and putting the power back up. And of course, people come in to help with that, but it still takes a long time to recover. Farmers lost income for a year or more. The pecan farmers, maybe, up to 10 years if they hadn't diversified, if they didn't have other crops. Some of that was offset by crop and property insurance, but certainly, as you know, insurance almost never completely covers you when you have a disaster like that. There were a lot of food losses and supply chain issues. People that were depending on that food in other parts of the country did not have access to the food, and so their prices went up. And so that was if they could get the food at all. Many rural communities lost their tax bases. In Seminole County, they lost 10% of their tax base because all of a sudden they weren't getting any income from the farms and from the processors that were processing peanuts and cotton and so on. So they lost their tax base, and that's money that goes towards police and libraries and schools and everything else. And that's something that takes time to recover from. Generally, generational losses of these pecan orchards and forest lots takes a long time to recover from that, if you ever can. And, of course, we're not even talking about the loss of life, the amount of stress that people go through. It's just an amazing thing. And I want to just close by saying there's a quote this morning on Twitter from Doug Mayo, who's in Florida Extension, who said that most buildings had been restored or torn down by this point, but the debt for the cleanup, the cost to do all that, still lingers today. So it's not gone. It's just changed from the immediate things that you can see to this long drag that's going to continue. That's all I've got. So I will stop there. This is my contact information in case you're interested. And I will turn it back over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Pam, for that. Those numbers are staggering when you actually think about the loss of agriculture and how much we depend on agriculture for food, for, everything from peanuts, soybean, corn, the poultry farms, the livestock that was impacted. So one of the questions I had is, in your work with Extension, because it's been 5 years, in these areas that were hardest hit, have you actually heard stories or have you seen people that have walked away because they haven't been able to recover?
I can't tell you of any specific people, but I've certainly heard stories of people that they couldn't recover. I mean, what do you do when you lose your entire, you lose your house, you lose all your pecan crops? What do? I mean, you start over, but are you going to start over in the same place, or are you going to move somewhere else where you might have family? And I know there were certainly people that just had to walk away from that. And I have not seen any statistics on how many people that was, but I imagine it probably was not a small amount.
So we got a question from Casper, and he said, with such a large timber loss, were there any changes to the communications of wildfire risks in the future? And how long might those risks, like increased risks, could be? Because you kind of mentioned with all that timber being down, and Mark even kind of mentioned a little bit about, fire weather issues. With all that timber that it could still be around, what would potentially be the length of increased risk?
Well, I think over time, some of those trees will start to be cleared out as time goes on. Some of it will just naturally decay, but there's a lot of dead wood that's still there. And I think that the next time we have a really big drought, that's going to be more of an issue. We haven't really had a drought. It's been pretty wet the last couple of years. This year it's been dry again, but not to the point where we had to worry too much about fires yet. And so I think as time goes on, that will become less of a risk. Of course, now we have a whole new set of damaged wood from Idalia. And so it's a little different part of the state, but it's all there and it all has to be dealt with as well.
So I'm going to give it another couple of minutes. Just if you have any additional questions you want to ask, feel free to put it in our Q&A. I do have one more for Mark. This came from Newton, and Newton wanted to know, how long was the office without communications, other than the cell phone communications to the outside world? How long were you actually impacted in the office?
Unfortunately, longer than I'd care to admit, but multiple days. We simply do not have redundant internet infrastructure in the National Weather Service. That may be hard for some people to believe, but we don't. It was cost prohibitive. So you can probably tell my opinion on that. So we were without power without the ability to use our primary operating system and get our products out to the world via that part of our internet capability. 5 days easily.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that was
unacceptable. It was very, so that put the onus, like I said, on our sister offices. So we not only relied on Jacksonville, but Mobile as well to kind of balance that out. So neither of their staffs were overburdened, because remember, they were sending people over to help us with surveys and other things like that too. And I just really wanted to quick speak to the wildfire thing. It took a couple of years for this field to dry out enough for that to be a concern to us. But along about that time, around the year 3 mark, we were really worried about it. And then we had a wet spring in 2021. It wasn't an issue, but last in 2022 in March, there was a humongous wildfire out there near Bay, Calhoun County, that they simply could not contain. And had it not rained heavily, not once, but 2 times, I don't know how big that fire would have gotten. So it is still very much a concern. Although, as Pam mentioned, as we move further out in time, there will be some decay of that wood, but there's still a lot out there.
Got one more question from the audience. Pam, this is for you. Isabella wanted to know, was there any noticeable effect of Michael's damage to the fields in the year after? So the 2019 with any type of agricultural production?
Yeah, I mean, the ground itself, probably the biggest single issue for livestock producers was the amount of debris that was in the fields. Cows will eat anything. And so people had to walk through the fields and pull out all this debris so that it wouldn't harm the animals. The ground itself was still, they hadn't lost fertility or anything like that. I did see a few comments after Irma about salinity being an issue in some of the fields. I didn't hear that so much from Michael, but the hurricanes put up a lot of ocean water and it's got salt in it. And so some of that gets deposited on the fields and can result in some reduced fertility. I think most of the crop producers, they work on a yearly kind of cycle. For the most part, we're back. They still had issues with infrastructure, but they were able to at least get out and start producing some crops again. Anything that has a longer time life, like a tree, pecan or pine, obviously takes a lot longer to recover from. And the peanut production, the infrastructure, most of them, I think, were probably put on a pretty fast track to get rebuilt. And so I think most of those were available within the next year or two. But there are some areas where if there was not insurance or if there was not enough people to really do the repairs that were needed, that just sat there for a while.
All right, so we're going to take our last question of the evening. This is from Kelly, and this is directed to Mark and Cass. If you and your colleagues had to do it all over again, is there anything you would have done differently? So I'm going to kick it to Cass first.
What we would have done differently. There's always room to improve on, processes and procedures. And, considering that we just had Idalia, which, was a more direct storm for the Tallahassee TV market. And it almost seems like it's a blur, even though it was just a few weeks ago. There are definitely some things that I would change in terms of the overall preparedness. And I do have to admit, our current station owners really went all out to rally the troops, so to say, to bring in resources from various stations in our group. And we really had a good layout of putting people where they needed to be. And I think that was another lesson that we learned from the experience with Michael, that if we wanted to give a fuller story of what was going on, in-depth, coverage that, people can see, hey, this is really what's happening and it's right in my backyard. It was to be able to fan out across the storm area. And I'd say in Idalia, we did kind of have that kind of coverage to where it's not just Tallahassee focused or, Taylor County focused where Idalia hit, but we did have people inland in Valdosta. We had people that were in Chiefland to the southeast. We had a couple folks that were in Wakulla County to the southwest. So I think that part of Michael may have been missing from our own local coverage, but we were able to expand on that in the recent experiences with Idalia.
Honestly, I'm pretty proud of the way the office responded, largely due to the leadership of our meteorologist in charge at the time, who had just been through the same thing the year before over in Texas. So we applied a lot of his lessons learned from Harvey to us and to our benefit as a staff and otherwise. Personally, I think I would have maybe looked for evacuation options a little earlier than I did. By the time I started looking to get my family to safety, there were not a lot of options left locally. We wound up finding something though, but so there's that. It's always tough when you have short timelines like that.
I think preparation is so key. And
Yeah.
this is true for everyone. You cannot make good decisions when you have 2 days to get out of town. You
No.
need to know way ahead of time, especially if you've got to worry about caring for animals or equipment, if you got to worry about getting your family out. Preparation ahead of time. Taking before and after pictures is important for insurance. You don't think about that either. Preparation is really the key.
So as Pam says, take your own advice. I'm giving people advice of what to do. You got to take your own advice. And part of my problem, and it was a problem for a lot of us, is we just couldn't get our minds wrapped around the fact that this was actually happening. That we were going to get this, not just unprecedented, but by such a degree, this massive hurricane that came out of virtually nowhere. As we're trying to get that messaging out to everyone else, we're trying to get our minds wrapped around it. Like, oh my God, we don't have any time left, and we've got to do all this preparation. So yeah, be as prepared as you possibly can be ahead of time. Tallahassee's not too far inland to worry about evacuating. So that's something you need to internalize that threat, right? And take care of yourself, or you're not gonna be able to take care of other folks.
That's a great advice, you guys. So we are over 8 o'clock. I did put a little message into chat to let all of our attendees know that I had a feeling we were going to go over, but I'm glad we did because we got so much in. Cass, Mark, Pam, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I learned so much, even as a meteorologist and a climatologist, attending these things and listening to others talk about their experiences and their perspectives. I still walk away with knowledge that I didn't have before. So thank you guys again for spending Tuesday evening with us. We really do appreciate that. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Gideon to close us out.
All righty. Thank you very much, Melissa. And I would like to echo what Melissa just said. That was fantastic. That was incredible. Thank you, all of you, for volunteering your time this late in the day to bring this to us. Very much appreciated. And I certainly learned a lot, and I know our audience did too. And speaking of audience, please remember that all of our webinars will be available to Weatherband members at amsweatherband.org. And of course, for our panelists and for our audience, if you have further questions or if you want to discuss the webinar more, we welcome you to discuss it on the Weatherband Community Forum. Please feel free to drop by and let's keep the conversation going there. And with that being said, I would like to once again thank our panelists and our moderator for bringing this to us today, and wish everybody a great evening. Take care, everyone, and thank you. See you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.